These are all 10 users of the One-for-All quirk, the legendary power passed on throughout the generation in order to stop the ultimate villain known as All-for-One. And the very first user was none other than the villain's younger brother, Yoichi Shigaraki. Yoichi was presumed to be quirkless and could only watch as his brother, All-for-One, committed atrocities around the world. When his brother forcibly implanted a power stockpiling quirk within him, it was discovered that he really did have a quirk, one with no other power than it could be transferred to others. These two quirks then merged with Yoichi, and ultimately, One-for-All was created. Due to his sickly state, he was unable to make good use of his newfound power. Instead, he decided to pass it on to other people in hopes that his new quirk would get stronger over time, and that eventually, someone strong enough would inherit it and stop his evil older brother once and for all. Yoichi had a strong sense of justice and was willing to stand against his brother, despite his weak body and his brother amassing a large collection of powerful quirks and loyal followers. Several decades later, when All-for-One and Tomura tried to steal One-for-All from Deku, Yoichi resisted them in the Vestige world. Even Tomura was stunned by Yoichi's willpower. As quirk types tend to run in families, it's likely that Yoichi's transference quirk always had the ability to absorb the quirks it came into contact with, much like how his brother's quirk could also take in multiple quirks. This is most likely what allowed his quirk to absorb and combine with the power stockpiling quirk and create One-for-All. Although Yoichi couldn't do anything against his brother, the second user was actually the leader of the resistance movement that tried to stop All-for-One. Before we continue, I'd like to ask you guys to subscribe to the channel. I literally paid an artist to make this drawing of Deku holding a subscribe button, so it would really mean a lot if you could subscribe. Thanks! Anyway, the second user has a large scar across the front of his face, which he received during his final battle against All-for-One, and wears a combat jacket with a large black collar. He's also equipped with a pair of gauntlets on his arms, which he uses to attack using projectiles powered up by his meta ability, Gear Shift. Aside from leading a resistance movement against All-for-One, he also did everything he could to fight back, including taking the lives of anyone who stood in his way. For example, he initially had plans to kill Yoichi due to his ties to All-for-One, but after learning that Yoichi actually opposed his brother's actions, he changed his mind and chose to save him instead. This action, inadvertently, is what allowed One-for-All to grow and be passed on. At first, he refused to accept Deku as a successor to the quirk, due to his optimistic and childish desires, but was eventually convinced by Yoichi and by seeing some of Deku's recent achievements. After Deku tried to use his meta ability for the first time, he reminded the young hero that using this ability should be a last resort, since the power can be devastating if not used carefully. He then provided Deku support when he activated Gear Shift and warned him he'll only be able to use it for 5 minutes. His proficiency with One-for-All is unknown. However, he probably wasn't a big threat to All-for-One, considering that the villain compared his Gear Shift ability to Pea Shooter. The third One-for-All user was also a part of the same resistance movement fighting against All-for-One. He was also there alongside the second Gear user during the assassination attempt on Yoichi. He was a man with hair tied in a spiky ponytail with a black bandana covering his forehead and wore a combat jacket with a pair of small escape tubes coming out of his shoulders. Just like the second user, he also refused to accept Deku as a successor to the quirk before coming around to it thanks to Yoichi. His proficiency with One-for-All is unknown, but he most likely used it in conjunction with his given quirk, 𝐵𝐺. This quirk allowed him to build up kinetic energy by repeating regular motions and store it for later use. When the user chooses to release the energy, they gain an explosive burst of speed and power. 𝐵𝐺 is actually named after the Chinese martial art technique with the same name. Number 4. Hikage Shinomori. Unlike the other users, Hikage chose not to confront All-for-One, aware of the enormous power gap between them, and instead spent his time in seclusion, training himself and strengthening One-for-All for his successor. During the final years of his life, his body started to break down, causing scars. Hikage's original quirk is called Danger Sense, and it allowed him to sense incoming threats in the surrounding area, giving him ample opportunity to react to them. According to Deku, once a threat is detected, a stabbing sensation is sent to the user's head. In All Might's notes about the previous One-for-All users, he scribbled out Hikage's cause of death. It was revealed that All Might scribbled out the cause of death due to suspicions he had about One-for-All's side effects, and thanks to this, the users learned the truth about the power. Anyone who wields One-for-All and already possesses a quirk will have their lifespan shortened due to the burden of powers on the body. Therefore, only the ones who are quirkless can wield One-for-All and use its full potential. Hikage was one of the users who wielded this power for the longest, the full 18 years. Shortly before dying, Hikage passed One-for-All on to the next user. Number 5. Daigoro Banjo. Daigoro was formerly known as the pro hero, Lariat, describing as being super funky. His proficiency with One-for-All is unknown, though he likely used it in conjunction with his given quirk, Black Whip, which allowed him to create tendrils of black energy from his arms. Daigoro was a large muscular man of wide build, usually wearing dark leather clothes, golden stylish goggles, and a bandolier. Although very little is known about this user, at some point, All-for-One attempted to steal One-for-All from him twice but failed. This implies that he had incredible willpower. At some point, point, 𝐷𝐸 transferred One For All to the next user after he was injured and trapped under a pile of rubble. He was killed by All For One shortly after transferring it. There were 5 more incredibly interesting characters to cover, and the next one is N. N was a former pro hero and the 6th user of the One For All quirk. Little is known about N's proficiency with this quirk other than he was not capable of bringing down All For One. Same with 𝐷𝐸, All For One also attempted to steal the quirk from N but failed. Besides One For All, N also had his own quirk called Smokescreen, which is actually a reference to his name, since N in Japanese means smoke. This quirk allowed him to create clouds of smoke, which could obscure vision. At some point as the 6th user, he met Nana Shimura, and after being fatally wounded in a battle with All For One, N gave Nana some of his hair so she could become the next One For All user. Number 7. Nana Shimura. Nana was the 7th user of the One For All quirk, the former mentor of All Might and the grandmother of Tenko Shimura. She was a very compassionate and noble individual, regarded as a truly great and exceptional hero. It's not really known how strong she was, but same as previous users, she wasn't strong enough to bring down All For One. Nana gave One For All to Toshinori sometime prior to her battle with All For One, which resulted in her death. Nana also had another quirk called Float, which granted her the ability to suspend herself in midair. The interesting fact about her is that the word Nana means 7 in Japanese, which is a reference to her being the 7th One For All user. Only 3 more characters are left, and these are some of the most powerful One For All users in the entire series. Number 8. Toshinori Yagi. Toshinori has wielded One For All longer than any other user, for a total of 40 years, while almost all other users were either killed by All For One or died of old age. The reason Toshinori was able to hold this quirk for so long is because he was born quirkless, meaning he could bear the burden of One For All much easier than people who already had their quirk. Toshinori would go on to become the hero All Might, and throughout his career he was regarded as the most powerful hero of all time and remained undefeated. With the goal of being a pillar of society and the symbol of peace, he put One For All to great use, defeating all sorts of criminals, rescuing countless people from danger, and turning himself into a legend. Most notably, he was the first holder to battle All For One and win, though he suffered severe and untreatable damage that significantly weakened him. Due to these injuries, All Might's respiratory system and stomach were left in very poor shape, and from then on he could only utilize his quirk for 3 hours a day. Any more and it would place too much strain on his body. It was for this reason he opted to become a teacher at UA High School, so that he could find a successor to pass One For All onto. This was a perfect plan, as he would also have an explanation to the public as to why he wasn't doing hero work as often. During his second battle with All For One, All Might depleted a majority of his remaining power from his body in order to defeat the villain, essentially leaving him quirkless once again. Although he can still transform for an instant, he cannot maintain his muscular form anymore, as it causes great strain on his body, reverting back very quickly. Having retired completely from heroic activity as a result, All Might now dedicates himself solely to assisting Deku in mastering the power of One For All so he may become a great hero of his own. Number 9. Izuku Midoriya. All Might initially didn't plan on passing his quirk to Deku, but after seeing his bravery and determination, he agreed to train him and chose him as his successor. Initially, Deku had very little control over the quirk and could only use One For All at 100% power and only in short bursts, grievously injuring his body each time. While this allowed him to unleash incredible displays of strength, it came at potentially lifelong physical costs, resulting in him currently having a visibly scarred right hand and arm. This is because the training Deku did prior to receiving the quirk was only the bare minimum needed for using One For All without his limbs being blown off completely. Later, Deku found a way to minimize the damage to himself by focusing One For All's power on just his fingers. While he still ended up breaking his fingers, he was able to strike powerful blows and generate strong air currents. Deku eventually realized that he was using One For All solely in the limbs, and to correct this, he developed One For All Full Cal. This ability takes advantage of the 5% that Deku can safely work with to increase his overall strength and agility by letting this small amount permeate his entire body. Using Full Cal, Deku can easily scale the side of buildings, jump large clearings between structures, and quickly navigate through cluttered areas. Deku could react to the speed of Gran Torino and even hold his own against Stain in his first real fight. Even so, if Deku does not remain aware and in control while using his quirk, he might go over his 5% limit and injure himself. During the 5th round of the joint training session between classes 1A and 1B, dark energy tendrils began to fire from Deku's arm that heavily damaged his surroundings and pulled him along against his will. Uraraka and Hitoshi were able to stop the rampage by brainwashing Deku and sending him into his subconscious. There he met 𝐷𝐸, the 5th user of One For All. 𝐷𝐸 explains that the quirk factors of the previous holders had merged with the core of One For All and increased in strength proportionally. He also tells Deku that there's 5 other quirks that he'll manifest in the future and that the one he's currently manifested is his own quirk when he was alive, Black Whip. He later managed to awaken all of those quirks in his future battles, them being Float, Danger Sense, Smokescreen, Fajin, and Gear Shift. 2 months later, by the time of the Paranormal Liberation War, Deku's proficiency with One For All has increased to allow him to momentarily use 45% without breaking his body. After unlocking Gear Shift and combining it with Fa-Jin through the ultimate move, Overdrive, Deku is capable of taking that 100% of power and turning it into what is described as 120%. Although Deku is the current One For All user, there's one more character who briefly had the power of this quirk, and it's none other than Bakugo. In a desperate attempt to stop 9, Deku decided to transfer the quirk to Bakugo by swapping blood through the open wounds on their hands, allowing both of them to utilize the immense power granted by One For All. Despite the period of transfer and possession being extremely brief, Bakugo demonstrated great proficiency with the quirk. He could instantly use One For All full cal 100% without any prior instruction, and his body could handle the sheer power of the quirk without being blown apart. When Bakugo used One For All to enhance his given quirk, Explosion, it became so powerful that even standard blasts could create enormous craters. In addition, the temperature of the explosions was also greatly increased, to the point where it could melt through solid rock in a similar manner to lava. At the end of his and Deku's fight against 9, Bakugo lost One For All, and the quirk remained in Deku's body. All Might initially suspected that the quirk stayed with Deku because Bakugo lost consciousness prior to the transfer's completion, but later theorized that One For All kept itself inside of Deku due to his willingness to protect others, even if it meant losing the power. This may mean that the transfer only lets Bakugo borrow some of the One For All power without actually possessing the quirk.